She lost her job standing up for an Apache horse. 1 hour later, the Apache war chief came to town. The horse was dying on the stable floor, blood pooled. Beneath its flank where something sharp had torn through skin and muscle. But it wasn't the wound that made Nora's breath catch. It was the markings. 3 blue lines crossed the animal's shoulder. Precise and deliberate, painted in a pattern she'd seen only once before in a book about tribal customs, sacred. Markings meant for horses of great importance. And Porter Dale, standing in the doorway with dust on his boots and lies on his tongue, wanted her to ignore everything she was seeing. The animals. Labored breathing filled the silence between them. She had minutes to decide. The choice would cost her everything. What she didn't know was that in exactly 1 hour, the man who owned this horse would ride into town with enough warriors to level every building on the street. Nora dropped to her knees beside the animal, her hands already moving across the wound before her mind caught up. The cut was fresh, maybe 2 hours old, made by rope or wire dragged. Too tight. The horse's eye rolled toward her, white with pain and confusion. Porter stepped closer, his shadow falling across her. Just patch it quick. Got a buyer coming at sundown. Her fingers stilled. Where'd you get him? Does it matter? She looked up at him. Porter Dale had owned the stable for 12 years. She'd worked under him for 5. Of those, shoeing horses, treating colic, delivering foss in the middle of winter nights. She knew his tells. The way his jaw tightened when he was hiding something, the slight shift in his stance when a question got too close to truth. It matters, she said quietly. Found him wandering near the canyon, no. Owner, fair game. The lie hung between them like smoke. Nora stood, her knees cracking, her hands still sticky with the horse's blood. He's got tribal markings. You know what that means? Porter's face hardened. I know what it means for my pocket now. Either you fix him so I can sell him, or you can clear out your things. Clifton, the stable hand, had stopped mucking stalls. He stood frozen 10 feet away, pitchfork in hand, watching. His eyes begged her to stay quiet, to let it go. Everyone in town knew Porter had connections with traders who didn't ask questions about where horses came from. Everyone knew, and everyone stayed silent. Nora looked back at the horse. Its breathing had become shallow, rapid. The animal was going into shock. Without treatment, it would be dead by nightfall. With treatment, Porter would sell it to someone who'd never know it had been stolen from people who would come looking for it. I need to remove the debris from the wound, she said. Clean it proper, stitch it. That takes time. You've got an hour. It needs more than that. Porter moved close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath. You questioning how I run my business? I'm saying this horse is suffering because someone dragged it here against its will. And those markings mean someone's going to come for it. His hand shot out and gripped her arm. Not hard enough to bruise, but firm enough to make his point. Listen close. I don't pay you to have opinions about where my stock comes from. I pay you to keep them breathing long enough to sell. Now you do your job or you're done here. The words came out before she could stop them. Then I'm done. Porter's grip released for a moment. Genuine surprise crossed his face. Then it hardened into something colder. Fine. Clear out now. Nora knelt back beside the horse, her hands moving to her satchel where she kept her supplies. Not until I treat this animal. You just quit. Doesn't mean I'm leaving him to die. Porter's boots slammed into the wall, making the horse flinch. Clifton, get her out of here. The stable hand didn't move. His eyes dropped to the floor. Nora worked quickly, pulling out clean cloth, a bottle of whiskey she kept for disinfecting, needle, and thread. Her hands knew the motions even as her mind raced. She was unemployed now, in a town this small with Porter's influence. She'd be lucky to find work mucking out pig stalls. But the horse's eye was still on her, and she'd made her choice. Porter stormed toward the door, then stopped. You've got no idea what you just did. No idea what's coming. She didn't look up from the wound then. I guess we'll both find out. The door slammed behind him. The stable fell. Quiet except for the horse's breathing and the distant sound of hoof beats growing louder in the distance. 1 hour later, those hoof beats would reach the town, and nothing would ever be the same. Nora's hands moved with practiced precision, threading the needle through torn flesh. The horse shuddered, but stayed still as if it understood she was trying to help. Clifton watched from the doorway, wringing his hands. Outside, the town went about its business, completely unaware that in 45 minutes, everything they knew would change. The sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the stable floor. Each stitch pulled the wound closed. Each minute brought whatever was coming closer. She worked in silence, cleaning the gash with whiskey-soaked cloth. The horses' breathing steadied slightly, the panic leaving its eyes. Up close, she could see more details she'd missed before. The 3 blue lines on the shoulder weren't paint. They were permanent marks made with natural dye pressed deep into the skin when the animal was young. Beneath them, smaller symbols she didn't recognize formed a pattern. You should leave town. Clifton's voice came quiet from behind her, before Porter spreads word about what you did. I didn't do anything wrong. Doesn't matter. He'll make sure no one hires you. You know how he is. Nora tied off the final stitch, her fingers aching. Then I'll find work somewhere else. Where? Next town's 3 days' ride. You got money for that? She didn't answer because they both knew she didn't. Everything she owned fit in one trunk at the boarding house. 5 years of wages, most of it spent on her room and meals. She had maybe enough for a week if she rationed carefully. The horse tried to lift its head. She placed a hand on its neck, feeling the rapid pulse beneath the skin. Easy now, you need to rest. Clifton stepped closer, his voice dropping even lower. I heard Porter talking to some men earlier before he brought that horse in. They were arguing about payment. Nora's hand stilled. What men? Didn't recognize them. Rough types, the kind that don't ask permission for things they want. He paused. One of them had a nasty cut on his face, fresh. She looked at the horse's hooves. Dried blood caked the right front shoe. Not the animal's blood. Someone else's. This horse fought back. She said softly, whoever took him got hurt doing it. Then whoever owned him is going to be angry. More than angry. She stood, wiping her hands on her work apron. The blood wouldn't come off completely, leaving rust-cold stains on the fabric. Horses like this don't wander off. They're trained from birth. Loyal. Someone stole him, and they knew exactly what they were taking. Clifton moved to the stable entrance, peering out at the street. You think they'll come looking? I know they will. The words had barely left her mouth when a sound reached them, distant at first, like thunder rolling across the plains. But the sky was clear. It wasn't weather. It was hoof beatots, many of them moving fast. Nora walked to the doorway and stepped outside. Other people on the street had stopped, too. Heads turned toward the sound. Mrs. Harding from the general store shaded her eyes with one hand. 2 men loading supplies onto a wagon went still. The hoof beatots grew louder, closer. A boy ran past, shouting something about riders coming from the canyon, from the direction of Apache territory. Clifton's face went pale. Oh no, 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 no. The stable owner from across the street, a man named Vernon, who'd always been cordial to Nora, called out, how many? The boy skidded to a halt, breathing hard. At least 20, maybe more, and they're not slowing down. People began moving. Some ducked into buildings. Others ran for the far end of town. A woman grabbed her child and pulled him inside the mercantile. Nora stood perfectly still, watching the eastern road where dust was beginning to rise in a cloud. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she didn't move. Behind her in the stable, the horse with the sacred markings let out a low, mournful sound. It wasn't a cry of pain, it was recognition. The animal knew who was coming, and now so did she. They came like a storm made of flesh and dust. The lead rider wore a headdress of white and red feathers that caught the sunlight as he moved. His face was weathered, deeply lined, the face of a man who'd survived more winters than most would ever see. Behind him, warriors spread across the width of the road, their horses moving in perfect formation. No one was shouting, no weapons were raised, but the threat in their silence was absolute. This was a war chief, and he had come for something that belonged to him. The entire town held its breath. Nora stood alone in front of the stable, her hands still stained with the horse's blood, watching as 20 armed men rode straight toward Her. The riders slowed as they entered the town proper. People watched from windows, from doorways, from behind. Wagons. No one stepped into the street. No one made a sound. The war chief's eyes swept across the buildings, methodical and thorough. He was looking for something specific. His gaze landed on the stable where Nora stood, and for a moment their eyes met across the distance. He raised one hand. The riders stopped as one. Clifton had disappeared somewhere inside the building. Vernon, from across the street, had pulled his door shut. Even the dogs that usually ran loose had gone quiet. The war chief dismounted in one fluid motion despite his age. He walked forward with the confidence of a man who'd never needed to prove his authority. The warriors remained mounted, watching. He stopped 10 feet from Nora. Up close, she could see the intricate beadwork on his shirt, the careful craftsmanship of every piece he wore. This wasn't just any leader. This was someone of profound importance. I am looking for what was taken from me. His voice was steady, his words in English clear, but accented, a horse marked with the symbols of my family. Nora's throat was dry, but she forced the words out. He's inside, he's hurt. Something shifted in the chief's expression, not quite surprised, but something close to it. You know this, I know the markings. I know he didn't wander off. Someone brought him here to sell. Where is this person gone? He left after I refused to help him hide what he'd done. The chief studied her face, her blood-stained hands, the dirt on her knees from kneeling beside his animal. Behind him, one of the warriors said something in Apache. The chief responded without taking his eyes off Nora. You're the one who cares for the town's animals. It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. I was until an hour ago. Why are you no longer? Because I chose the horse over my job for the first time. Something like respect flickered across his features. He moved past her toward the stable entrance. Nora followed her, heart pounding. The warriors remained outside, but their attention was absolute. One wrong move from anyone in town, and this would end badly. Inside, the horse lifted its head when the chief entered. Despite its injuries, despite its exhaustion, the animal tried to stand. A sound came from its throat, almost like a greeting. The chief dropped to his knees beside the horse, his hands moving over the animal's neck, its flanks finding the wound Nora had stitched. His jaw tightened when he spoke. His voice was thick with emotion held barely in check. This was my son's horse, given to him when he became a warrior. He died 6 moons ago, and this animal was all I had left of him. Nora felt the weight of those words settle over the room. She'd saved something irreplaceable, something that couldn't be measured in money. The chief stood slowly. His eyes, when they met hers again, held a question that made her stomach clench with fear. Who took him? Outside, Porter's voice cut through the silence, loud and aggressive. He'd returned, and he'd brought others with him, men with rifles, men who decided that facing down Apache warriors was better than admitting theft. The chief's hand moved to the weapon at his belt. Every warrior outside shifted in their saddles. Nora stepped between the chief and the door, knowing it was the most dangerous place she'd ever stood in her life. What she said next would either save everyone or doom them all. Porter Dale stepped into the street with 6 armed men behind him. He carried a rifle loosely in one hand, the barrel pointed down, but ready. His face was flushed, whether from alcohol or rage. Nora couldn't tell. Vernon and 3 other business owners flanked him, their expressions tight with fear disguised as resolve. They weren't defending principles, they were defending property and pride. Porter's eyes locked on the chief, standing in the stable doorway, then shifted to Nora. The hatred in his gaze was pure and simple. She'd humiliated him, cost him money, and now she stood beside the very people he'd stolen from. He raised his voice so the whole town could hear every word meant to condemn her. That woman has no authority here. She's a thief and a liar, who sided with savages over her own people. The slur hung in the air like smoke. Several warriors shifted on their horses, hands moved toward weapons. The chief remained perfectly still, but Nora saw the muscle in his jaw twitch. One word from him, and this street would run red. She stepped forward, placing herself directly between the two groups. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. The only thief here is you, Porter. You brought a stolen horse to my stable and told me to ignore the evidence. Evidence? Porter laughed harsh and bitter. You mean marks on an animal? Could have come from anywhere. They're permanent tribal markings. You knew exactly what you had. Vernon spoke up, his voice uncertain. Porter, if the horse is theirs, maybe we should just hand it over. Avoid trouble. I paid good money for that animal. The chief's voice cut through the argument like a blade. You paid thieves, the men who took him from my land. One of them now bears the scar my son's horse gave him. He gestured toward the stable. The blood is still on the hoof. Porter's face darkened. I don't know anything about thieves. I bought him fair, then show me the men who sold him to you. The chief said, let them explain how they came to possess what belonged to my dead son. A long silence followed. Porter's grip on his rifle tightened. Behind him, one of the townsmen whispered something urgent. Porter shook his head, jaw set. Nora's mind raced. She'd seen the men earlier, heard Clifton mention them. If Porter couldn't produce them, it proved he knew. The horse was stolen, but admitting that meant admitting he'd lied to everyone, that he'd nearly started a conflict that would have gotten people killed. You can't, Nora said quietly, because they're long gone. You paid them to disappear, didn't you? Porter's eyes flashed. Shut your mouth. You knew the horse was stolen. You knew someone would come looking. That's why you wanted him sold before sunset, before anyone could trace him back to you. I said, shut up. The rifle came up, not aimed at the warriors, but at her, the barrel pointing at her chest from 15 feet away. Her blood went cold. She'd pushed too far, revealed too much, and now Porter had nothing to lose. Behind her, she heard the chief move, heard weapons being drawn, heard horses stamping, ready to charge. The whole town balanced on the edge of violence, and she was the one who tipped it there. Porter's finger rested on the trigger, sweat bead on his forehead. You've cost me everything, my reputation, my business, all for some animal that ain't even yours to save. He's not mine, Nora said, surprised by the calm in her voice, but he deserves better than dying in your stable so you could make profit off someone else's grief. Grief? Porter spat. They're just the chief's hand shot up, stopping whatever slur was about to follow. His voice dropped to something deadly quiet. Finish that sentence, and your words will be the last thing you speak. Vernon grabbed Porter's shoulder. For the love of everything, put the rifle down, but Porter didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on Nora, and in them, she saw a man who'd lost everything and wanted someone to pay for it. His finger tightened on the trigger. The shot never came. Instead, someone else's voice rang out from behind the warriors, clear and commanding, speaking words in Apache that made every mounted man turn their heads. A woman emerged from the crowd of warriors, moving her horse forward with practiced ease. She was younger than the chief, perhaps 40 years, with long, dark hair bound in a single braid. Her clothing was simpler than his, but the authority in her posture was unmistakable. She spoke again in Apache, her tone sharp and urgent. The chief listened, his expression shifting from rage to something more calculating. He responded in their language, then turned back to face Porter and Nora. The tension hadn't broken, but it had shifted somehow, like a storm changing direction at the last moment before it strikes. Whatever the woman had said, it had altered the course of what was about to happen. The chief addressed the crowd, his voice carrying to every corner of the street. My sister speaks wisdom. She says, we came for what is ours, not to shed blood over a coward's lies. His eyes fixed on Porter with contempt. You are not worth the cost of war. Porter's rifle lowered slightly, uncertainty replacing his earlier fury. Vernon exhaled, relief visible in the way his shoulders sagged. But the chief wasn't finished. He turned to Nora. You treated my son's horse. You defended him when you had much to lose. This is the action of someone with honor. He paused, letting the words settle among my people. Such a deed creates obligation. You have shown respect to what was precious to me. I will remember this. Nora felt the weight of every eye on her, the entire town watching. Porter's face twisted with anger and disbelief. The chief gestured toward the stable. I will take what belongs to me. The animal needs more healing. Yes, yes, Nora said. The wound is closed, but he shouldn't travel hard for at least a week. Then he will walk slowly, and we will care for him. The chief nodded to two of his warriors. They dismounted and entered the stable. Moments later, they emerged, leading the pinto carefully, supporting its weight. The horse moved stiffly but willingly, its eyes fixed on the chief. When the animal reached him, the chief placed both hands on its neck, his forehead touching its mane. He stayed that way for several breaths, a private moment of grief and reunion that no one dared interrupt. Finally, he stepped back. His sister had dismounted as well, and she approached Nora directly. Up close, her face was kind. Despite the hardness in her eyes, "You could have walked away," she said in English. "Kept your position, your comfort. Most would have. It wasn't right," Nora replied simply. The woman studied her for a long moment. "My brother lost his only son. This horse was trained by that boy from a cult. Every memory of him lives in this animal." She reached into a pouch at her belt and withdrew something wrapped in soft leather. "We do not forget debts." She pressed the object in Nora's hand. Before Nora could respond, the woman had returned to her horse. The chief mounted as well, the warriors forming up around him and the injured horse. He looked down at Porter one last time. "If I see you or your men near my land again, I will not be merciful." Porter said nothing. His rifle hung uselessly at his side. The riders turned and began moving back the way they'd come, slowly accommodating the injured horse's pace. The dust rose around them, and within minutes, they disappeared beyond the edge of town. Nora stood alone in the street, her hand closed around whatever the chief's sister had given her. Around her, people began emerging from buildings, voices rising. In a confused mix of relief and argument, Porter's supporters clustered around him, some angry, others clearly shaken. Vernon approached her carefully. "You're either the bravest woman in this territory or the most foolish. Maybe both," she said quietly. He glanced at her closed fist. "What did she give you?" Nora opened her hand, resting in her palm was a small carved stone, polished smooth with symbols etched into its surface. She didn't know what they meant, but she understood the message. Respect given, respect returned. Porter's voice shattered the moment. "You're finished here. No one in this town will hire you. No one will even speak to you." He was right. She'd known at the moment she defied him, but somehow holding the stone, she didn't care as much as she thought she would. What she didn't know was that her choice had been witnessed by more than just the people of this town, and some witnesses carried consequences she couldn't yet imagine. The boarding house owner met Nora at the door that evening with her trunk already packed. Mrs. Harding's face was apologetic, but firm. She set the trunk on the porch and wouldn't meet Nora's eyes. The message was clear without words needing to be spoken. Porter's influence reached everywhere in this town, and anyone who sheltered her would face the same isolation she now carried. Nora stood on the wooden steps, watching the sun sink lower, painting the sky in shades of copper and rust. She had no job, no room, and barely enough coins in her pocket to buy a meal. The carved stone in her other pocket felt heavier than it should, a reminder that honor sometimes costs everything you have. She walked to the edge of town as darkness gathered, her trunk balanced on one shoulder. The weight made her steps uneven, but she refused to set it down where people could see her struggling behind closed doors. She felt eyes watching, some with satisfaction, others with guilt they'd never voice aloud. At the old miller's shed, abandoned since the previous year, when the creek had shifted course, she found shelter. The roof leaked in one corner, and mice had made homes in the walls, but it was dry enough. She set her trunk down and sat on it, staring at nothing. Her stomach growled. She'd eaten nothing since morning. The coins she would buy bread, maybe some dried meat if she haggled enough for 3. Days if she was careful. After that, she'd have to figure something else out. Footsteps approached in the darkness. Nora stood quickly, her hand moving to the knife she kept for work. The figure that emerged from the shadows was small, slight, carrying something wrapped in cloth. Ruth, the woman who owned the boarding house, stepped into the moonlight. Her face was drawn with worry. "I can't let you stay. You understand that, don't you?" "I understand." Ruth held out the wrap bundle. "But I won't let you starve either. There's bread, cheese, some dried fruit. It's not much." Nora's throat tightened. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did." Ruth glanced back toward town. "What you did today, standing up like that. Some of us noticed. Some of us remember what it means to have principles. Then why won't anyone stand with me?" "Because we're afraid." Ruth's voice cracked slightly. "Porter controls the freight contracts, the supply lines. The land office. Cross him, and he can ruin you. Not just you, but your family, your livelihood, everything. So everyone just accepts it." "Not everyone." Ruth pressed the bundle in Nora's hands. "Clifton came by my place an hour ago. Said to tell you he saw everything today. Said when the time comes he'll testify to what Porter did." Nora felt something shift her chest. One voice wasn't much, but it was more than nothing. Ruth continued. "Vernon, too. He told his wife tonight that what you did was right, even if it cost you everything. He said Porter's been dealing in stolen goods for years, and someone needed to finally say it out loud, but they won't say it themselves. Not yet, but if you can prove it, if you can make it impossible for people to ignore, they might find their courage." Ruth squeezed Nora's hand. "Porter's meeting with his business partners tomorrow at noon at the freight office. I heard them talking at the boarding house. They're worried about what happened today, about what it means for their dealings." Nora's mind began working. "If someone could hear what they're discussing, don't do anything stupid." Ruth interrupted. "You've already lost enough." But Nora was already thinking ahead. Porter thought he'd won. Thought she'd slink away defeated and forgotten. He didn't know that losing everything meant she had nothing left to fear. Ruth left as quietly as she'd come. Nora ate half the bread and wrapped the rest carefully. Tomorrow at noon, Porter would be discussing business, the kind of business he didn't want anyone overhearing. The freight office had a crawl space beneath the floorboards where she'd once retrieved a cat for the clerk. She lay down on her coat, using her trunk as a pillow. Sleep didn't come easy, but when it did, she dreamed of carved stones and horses with sacred markings. And somewhere in those dreams, a plan began to form. The crawl space beneath the freight office smelled of dirt and rot. Nora lay on her stomach in the darkness, breathing shallow through her mouth to avoid coughing. Above her, floorboards creaked as boots moved across the room. Porter's voice carried clearly through the gaps between planks. 3 other men were with him, their voices tense and urgent. One she recognized as the freight manager from the next town over. The others were strangers with rough voices and rougher language. They were discussing business, and the more Nora heard, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't about one stolen horse. This was about years of systematic theft, bribes, and deals with men who took what they wanted from Apache territory and sold it to Porter for quick profit. The problem, Porter was saying, is that woman opened her mouth in front of witnesses. Now people are asking questions. The freight manager's voice was harsh. "Then you should have kept her quiet. Should have made sure she understood what happens to people who cross you. I tried. Fired her, got her evicted. What else was I supposed to do?" More than that, a third voice, cold and calculating. "She made you look weak in front of those warriors. Made you back down. That's going to cost you respect. And respect is everything in this business." Nora's hands clenched in the dirt. She'd brought a small notebook and pencil stolen from the clerk's desk. Before hiding in the thin light coming through the floorboard cracks, she began writing names, dates, details of transactions. They described evidence. Porter's boots stopped directly above her head. "The next shipment comes through in 2 days. Horses mostly. Some of them will have markings. We'll need to move them fast before anyone can trace them." "What about the Apaches?" After today, they got what they came for. They won't be back." Porter's voice hardened. "And if they do come back, we'll be ready. I've got men willing to make sure any tracking parties don't return home. The threat hung in the air. Nora wrote faster, her pencils scratching quietly against paper. They were planning to continue the thefts, planning violence if necessary, planning to blame it on wandering animals and fair salvage. The freight manager spoke again. What about the woman? She's still a problem. She's nothing, broke, homeless, no prospects. Give it a week, and she'll be gone from this town. Nobody's going to listen to her, even if she tries to talk. Nora felt anger burn hot in her chest. They dismissed her, counted her as beaten. That was their mistake. Above chairs scraped. The meeting was ending. She needed to get out before they left and potentially discovered her hiding spot. She began crawling backward toward the access panel she'd entered through, moving as quietly as possible. Her elbow bumped something metal. It discarded. Lantern left in the crawl space and forgotten. It rattled, not loud, but in the silence beneath the floor. It sounded like thunder. The boots stopped moving above. What was that? Nora froze, her heart hammering. She was 15 feet from the exit, too far to run, too exposed to hide. Probably rats, one of the men said. Check it anyway. Footsteps moved toward the access panel. Nora's mind raced. If they found her herewith her notebook full of their confessions, they wouldn't just throw her out of town. They'd make sure she never told anyone what she'd heard. The access panel began to open, lights spilling into the crawl space. Nora pressed herself against the far wall, barely breathing. She could see the man's shadow, could hear him muttering as he peered inside. Then voices erupted outside, shouting. Horses. Confusion. The man at the access panel straightened up. What now? Porter's voice was sharp with alarm. That's coming from the stable. All four men moved at once, their boots pounding. Across the floor and out the door. Nora didn't waste the chance. She scrambled to the access panel, pulled herself through, and emerged behind the freight office. Her dress was filthy with dirt and cobwebs, but clutched in her hand was the notebook, evidence, proof of everything they'd said. She ran toward the abandoned miller's shed, her lungs burning. Behind her, the shouting continued. Whatever had caused the distraction, it had saved her life. Only when she was safe inside the shed door barred did she allow herself to breathe. She opened the notebook, reading what she'd written by the last light of day. Every word was there, every confession, every threat. Now she just had to figure out what to do with it and who she could trust to listen. The federal marshal arrived 3 days later, brought by a message Nora had sent through Ruth's cousin, who traveled the territory roads. Marshal Boone was a weathered man with sharp eyes who'd seen enough corruption to recognize it when presented with evidence. Nora met him at the edge of town and handed him the notebook. He read every page twice, his expression growing darker with each word. Then he asked her one question that would determine everything. Could anyone else confirm what she'd heard? She told him about Clifton and Vernon, about Ruth, about the witnesses who'd watched Porter threaten her with a rifle. The marshal nodded slowly and rode into town with purpose that couldn't be ignored or bribed away. By noon, Porter Dale stood in the street outside his freight office, surrounded by armed men who weren't his employees. The marshal had brought deputies, official authority that superseded local influence. People gathered, drawn by the commotion, by the sight of Porter's face gone pale with understanding. Marshal Boone read the charges loud enough for everyone to hear: receiving stolen property, conspiracy with known thieves, threats of violence, obstruction of justice, each charge backed by written evidence and witness testimony. Clifton stepped forward when called, his voice shaking but clear. He described the men who'd brought the horse, the blood on their hands, the way Porter had paid them quickly and sent them on their way. Vernon followed, confirming years of suspicious transactions, goods that appeared without proper documentation, horses that bore markings they shouldn't have. Porter tried to argue, to deflect, to call it all lies from disgruntled workers, but the notebook was damning. His own words overheard and recorded, his own plans laid bare. The marshal place Porter in irons. You'll stand trial in the territorial capital, judge. That doesn't take kindly to men who profit from theft and threaten war with the Apache nations as deputies led Porter away. His business partners scattered. Some left town that same day. Others tried to distance themselves, claiming ignorance, but the damage was done. The freight office was shuttered. The stable closed pending investigation. Vernon found Nora that evening. His face carried shame in something else. Respect earned too late, but present nonetheless. The stable needs management. While this gets sorted out, he said, town council voted. They want you to run it temporary at first, but if you do, right by it, the position's yours permanent. Nora looked at the building where she'd lost everything 3 days ago. Now they were offering it back, not as a gift, but as acknowledgement that they'd been wrong. Double the wages Porter paid, she said firmly. And I choose my own workers. Vernon didn't hesitate. Done. 2 weeks later, as Nora was organizing the stable's records, riders appeared on the eastern road. She recognized them immediately. The chief and his sister, accompanied by a small group, the Pinto horse walked between them, moving easier now, its wound healing clean. That they didn't dismount. The chief simply nodded to her, a gesture of equals. His sister smiled, something warm and knowing in her expression. Then they continued past the town, heading toward the open country beyond, but they left something behind. A young horse barely 2 years old, standing tied to the stable post with a note in Apache in English, for the one who honors what others value. Nora ran her hand along the horse's neck, feeling its strength, its trust. She thought about carved stones and sacred markings, about choices that cost everything and gave back something words couldn't measure. The town had given her back her job, but this gift meant more. It meant she'd been right to stand alone when no one else would. It meant some things were worth losing everything to protect. She led the horse into its new stall, whispering promises of good care and better days outside. The sun set over a town that had learned what one woman's courage could teach. Porter was gone. Justice, though delayed, had arrived. And Nora Whitley, once fired for defending a horse, now stood exactly where she belonged, free, respected home. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier where honor and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything.